So the camera only gets bumped on by Zoom, but then
let's get to the other questions from the.
okay. We're back to how to get you. Perfect. Okay. What part is it? This is part 2. We had some minor connection issues. Oh, thanks very much. This is the Gabriel t-shirt.
So just answer the questions on the live stream part 1 there. Just give people a minute to rejoin. Give me a second. Will there ever be a return of Cooking with CK? Yeah, yes, it's
Absolutely.
up, but it's just not. We just haven't scheduled it in. It's nice how people want that back, though.
Yeah.
They took a lot of work. Fuck me,
Yeah.
so much hassle.
They take a long time.
Do you guys like safety squat bars? Only if someone is injured, if they can't hold a bar due to a shoulder issue maybe, or wrist or elbow, if they have a particular need to not. So that's the only time we'd ever use them. Any other time, they're just not that particularly useful. There's nothing majorly wrong with them in terms of they just don't really do anything particularly useful that a squat. We won't get more benefit from using a squat and not a straight bar or normal bar. Specialty bars just are only useful in a very particular context. So we'd never give anyone specialty bars in a general context on programs, you know, for example, powerlifting or weightlifting or anything. You know, like there's like the football bars, you know, Chris Duffin has like his fucking Optimus Prime Transformer bar, whatever the fuck it is, like safety squat bars. You'd only ever give those in context of a very specific scenario, and that's usually if someone's injured, and you don't want to be mandating the use of something for someone unless they're injured. You don't want to be, you don't give it out unless someone's injured, so there's no reason you'd ever be really using them, to be honest. There's nothing particularly useful on most of them.
Like the safety squat bar, the application is a more quad dominant, the more upright squat. For us, the high bar back squat is a much more effective tool for training that squat, you know, like an upright squat where someone is really, really in control of their torso and using their quads in a back squat. And then obviously the front squat is a more effective tool if you just want to train someone anteriorly. It's just a much better, like it's a better tool for the job. It's using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. A lot of the time people just kind of bullshit their way through and say, like the example of a powerlifter using a safety squat bar to get stronger quads rather than learning how to do a high bar back squat or squat with their heels small bit closer together and their toes pointed straight ahead. Like it doesn't take more time, and the tool itself is much more effective. The safety bar is just kind of just a band-aid that you put over someone if they have ineffective movement patterns. They are very effective though. Like when I did my collarbone the year before last, really effective for that because you can just hold on here. You don't have to really open your chest, and you can still acquire some volume. I certainly wouldn't like to be squatting heavy with one though, because they don't whip, they don't bend, or have any amount of give in the bar at all. Which, if you're used to squatting with a slightly whippier bar, is something you can get caught out by quite easily.
Ollie Force says, should an athlete train body parts they don't use in sports? So, for example, a cyclist training upper body or a kayaker like me lowering. So the misconception and the misnomer you see with, for example, that statement, or you see it in rock climbers, or you see it in arm wrestlers, is the idea that every body part isn't involved in any movement in your body. Every muscle is involved in every joint action you do, essentially, to varying degrees, but they're all used, they're all mandated to more or less degree. And the stronger all of them are, the more useful it is to all of them. So for example, if you think about arm wrestlers not training their legs. They're like, oh, I'm shouldn't just move my arm. But if you think about where the power transfer is going through you and your stabilization, it's always going to your lower body and your legs. And it's vital that they're as strong as possible. Think about climbers. I don't know why they never think, because they do use their legs in climbing. So I don't know why it's a thing in climbing to not use your legs. If you use that train of thought, your legs are massively used. But
I think their thing is holding on to body weight low down.
Yeah.
Like they're just very afraid of that.
It's very, very superficial thinking. And it's definitely misguided.
The other thing you need to think about is, so most of the things we're doing when we're training, like physical training in a gym setting or physical training in like an aerobic setting where you might be out of the gym, most of the things you're doing there are like you're seeking a biochemical response, So if we're looking for hypertrophy to get bigger arms, be more jacked, put on some size in our upper body, we're seeking a biochemical response, right? It's not just that I break down just this muscle tissue and that muscle tissue reacts that, and then I get a bigger bicep, right? Most of what you're doing is you're creating an environment of hypertrophy within the body. So all of those growth factors, all of that IGF-1, everything that's being released in the body, that's systematic. It's not specific to an area. So it's when you see bodybuilders doing back squats or deadlifts, they're doing it to get bigger overall. It's not just this one area of the body where training will get bigger. Their entire system will start to get bigger. There's obviously bilateral transfer, so training of the right arm making the left arm stronger. So it's not just specific, So if you're a kayaker and you're looking to get stronger, like power strokes or whatever for the start of the race, you should certainly be utilizing some squats, some deadlifts, some power cleans, because you getting stronger at those will make your midline stronger, will make your upper body stronger, and then make you better at kayaking. It's getting generally stronger, so in a specific setting, then you can be stronger as well.
Oliver said, have you heard about teaching only technique based on your physical proportions? Yeah, so that would be not really something, that wouldn't be a fringe thought. That would be something that's just, you teach people classical technique and then you make adjustments based on their body type and proportions. So it wouldn't be something unusual. It's just something that happens naturally with good coaches who understand technique. They'll just adjust their lifting based on their body proportions and to ensure correct technique. So it's definitely something that's just done just commonly, consistently throughout. I wouldn't consider it a fringe technique for sure.
To be honest, most of the larger structures that have their frameworks written out, like the IWF framework, EWF framework, the American stuff, a lot of the Russian stuff, they all have accounted for that. So they're like, this is classical technique, and then this is how you change it for X, Y, and Z. This is classical technique. This is what a lighter lifter, this is what a heavier lifter, this is what a taller lifter, shorter lifter might need to do. So it's definitely not anything strange.
Enoch Crosby says, I got a question. When I catch cleans, the barbell is directly over midfoot. This is on the last thing.
Yeah.
Whereas my front squat, the barbell is in front of my toes. Any idea? So that sounds like it's probably an issue with your front squat as opposed to your clean. I hopefully stuff will be over your midfoot, especially in the clean. In the front squat, adjust your front squat based on what would make it over your midfoot. It's kind of hard to see now what it probably would be. It most likely is that your torso is forward, the inclining as you're squatting, so your hips are going back. Most likely it's fine on the way down, but as you go up, then you probably see a forward incline of your torso on the way up. So I would say realistically you need to adjust based on that, which is either upper back strength, having your foot stance wide enough that your hips can sit in between your heels, that you have enough forward knee travel, that you have the ability to have enough forward knee travel, that you have the ability to have enough forward knee travel and maintain upright, you have enough mobility in the front rack. So look at those couple of things, Enoch.
The other case that could be happening is a lot of people jump their feet too wide in the clean, and then you're trying to front squat with this kind of good front squat stance, but you don't have those movement parameters Gareth talked about. So you're probably trying to front squat with toes relatively straight ahead and your hips roughly shoulder width apart or maybe a bit narrower. And when you bring your knees forward and you're trying to stay upright, it's like the only place you can go is up onto your toes, because all the weight is moving forward. Whereas I bet if you looked at your clean, your stance, you probably go way toes out, way wide, and you pull the bar back into yourself, and your knees aren't really forward at all when you catch the clean. Either way, you've work to do, both on your clean and on your front squat. and it's probably ankles is where that starts.
Kool-Aid Blue says, could Ulrich Vardanian have lifted more if he made contact? So no was the answer, because he did make contact. It's just the appearance of the kind of contact he was making in his lifts made it seem like he was not heavily emphasizing a lot of contact, but to me, he was using the appropriate amount of contact for him on those lifts. So given that he was such a high-ranked lifter in terms of Sinclair and all-time lifts, then there's no way I would imagine he could have lifted more based on his technique in reality, given what I can remember his technique off the top of my head, but I don't think there's anything.
No, I think he just didn't make smashy contact. Like, his contact was incredibly effective. To be honest, everybody makes too much contact. In my opinion, when you look at very, 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 very good lifters and people who have optimized their technique, they make less contact than general populations. I think if you're somebody who smashes about your hips, it's probably the number one issue you have with your lifting, and definitely the biggest bang for buck in terms of making less contact or making a less aggressive contact will make you much, much stronger in the long term.
Can you remember how much that GF gym was in Belfast for a session? I'm there and was looking to switch gyms and want to scout it. I think we left something like £10 or something. I'm not really sure. I would say it's a great gym. It's definitely
Really
well
good
worth. I would
gym.
definitely train there if I was in Belfast, without a doubt. I don't know where else I would train, because it's a very, very well equipped, very nice gym. The only issue I could see is it being very cold in the winter, which is certainly an issue, but it's a very, very well equipped gym.
It's called Gain Fourth as well, if you're looking for it.
Do you give any credence to the barefoot shoe movement, not necessarily for training, or for regular daily use? Yeah, I do, for sure. Absolutely. I wouldn't give it credence in terms of people being like it's going to change your performance. I wouldn't give it in terms of people are going to eliminate all their injuries. I wouldn't say it's going to increase your athletic performance, but I do think there is some credence for it, for sure, in terms of just day-to-day living and working. I think it is a nice adjustment, so I would definitely look into it. It does make sense. You know, it is very obvious. If you would imagine that with any other joint or body part, you would see drastic changes.
I think especially for strength athletes or weightlifters, powerlifters, crossfitters who are training a lot but not doing a huge amount of kind of proprioceptive work, I think the barefoot stuff or wearing lower profile shoes, it's going to make you a hell of a lot more stable overall. So just getting your general movement in with those will make you a lot more stable when it comes to the kind of high stability stuff you're going to need, like for squats, deadlifts, cleans, whatever it is. I think you should be like as minimal a sole as possible, as minimal a lift going from the heel to the toe as possible, and then not having all this kind of big bouncy cushion underneath your feet. That's a great way to make your lower body incredibly unstable.
I would always wear flat heel shoes. Since I remember Kelly Sarah talking about 10 years ago about how higher heel shoes soften and shorten the length of your Achilles, not soften, shorten the length of your Achilles if you permanently wear slightly elevated shoes for day-to-day living. So I would have always worn Converse. But what I wear at the moment is the Innovates F45 lights. And I've definitely, so it's been about 2 years. Is it 2 years or 1 year? 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
2 years. And my feet have gotten noticeably more muscular in the last 6 months, even from wearing them very routinely. So I would have always worn safety shoes at work, which were incredibly the opposite of minimal shoes. But because obviously the last year I've been wearing whatever shoes I want to wear. Basically it's always been the Innovates bar direct shoes or whatever. So I've definitely noticed my feet have gotten more muscular. I commented on a few weeks ago saying, holy shit, I can actually see. And I didn't have any arch issues or, compressed toes or anything like that before any major issue beyond normal. But I definitely noticed there's just more tone, definition, aesthetic in my feet, which is very, very interesting from the minimal shoes. And Innovate aren't even the most minimal, but they're as close as I would get before the aesthetics would be a con for me.
5 toes, like
I don't. Some of the barefoot stuff, I'm not a huge fan of how it looks for day to day. The Innovates are very what I want from a shoe.
Like this is like flat soled as well,
Yeah.
Like this is, to be honest, I think this is what most people that I'm talking about, like nice wide toe walks. Same with like Converse and stuff if they fit your size of foot well.
Yeah.
And obviously those because they have a more flexible midsole. But the other thing is like people who squat and lift weights get kind of injuries that are very preventable by just having a small bit more work in the foot and the lower leg done. Like a lot of the knee stuff we see comes from people gradually trying to get their knees further forward in the squat and having no prep work done, or they're on their squats, they're starting to get a small bit of valgus knee rotation, or they're trying to force vagus knee rotation and they're not able to do it. And it's because they have no stability in their feet to be able to kind of create tension and create torque into the ground. Like, a lot of these things would be made better if you didn't wear your Nike Air Max with a big heel in them or whatever it was, you know, if you just had a small bit more strength in your foot. I'm in the unbelievably gifted position of having fucked up my feet when I was younger and gotten loads of physio exercises through, like rolling up towels at your feet and stuff. And it just means I've like supremely long toes and very strong feet, and I've never had an issue with it since.
Scott Kirk, oh no, not Scott. Alex Arquila says, when do you think was the last major breakthrough in weightlifting training, training system, bumpers, etc.? The use of anabolic steroids was the last. I was just about to say. Was the last major breakthrough. So there's definitely been a decrease in weightlifting knowledge every decade since the probably 80s, as in terms of just less
systematic education and science
and experience, I would say. So major breakthrough was anabolics. Everything else since then is just superfluous, very pleasant to use for training people, but the major breakthrough would have been anabolics for sure.
I think if you were looking for a very recent bump in terms of popularity of weightlifting, and weightlifting probably being able to prolong its relevance. Are you itching for it again?
Yeah.
Prolong its relevance in kind of modern sport. CrossFit is definitely the next thing. Besides, so like anabolics, basically nothing else has mattered in the middle. And then the only other thing, the other big bump in the road will be weightlifting getting kicked out of the Olympics if that was to happen. But CrossFit and the popularization of weightlifting for kind of normal populations or adult populations, non-sporting populations, CrossFit's probably the only other bump that will make any difference over the kind of long term.
Any advice for a hockey goalkeeper just in doing powerlifting?
I have some advice.
Go for it.
Like, hockey is obviously, the stronger you are, the better you're going to be. But in terms of how you plan your training and how you structure your training, powerlifters tend to go a lot of the time where they're like a hypertrophy phase or a volume phase or an accumulative phase. Then they have a strength realization phase, and then they may have a taper. So your block might last 12 to 16 months. What I would do is I would have volume phase, very short strength realization phase, or very short specific strength phase. And then I would spend the other 30 or 40% of the time in a power production phase. So the main thing that limits our power production for nearly everyone is going to be the amount of strength you have. Because you've done a good bit of powerlifting training, or you've done some powerlifting training, you'll know how to program this piece. So this piece, that 8 weeks of volume work, capacity work for strength, then probably 3 weeks of strength realization or testing your strength. And then your next 30 to 40% of your training should be all to do with power production. It doesn't have to be power cleans. It doesn't have to be push jerks from the rack, anything like that. It just needs to be well-selected exercises for power, and then you need to be working in the correct load ranges, right? So it's probably going to be 3 to 5 reps for around 5 sets. And for most people, it'll be somewhere between 60% and 80% of 1RM. If you don't have access to the testing to figure out what percentage is going to be for you, I would start at 60%, do most of my training there, then go 65%, most of my training there, 70%. And you'll notice when that bar isn't moving as quickly, or you're not as powerful as you were before. So you'll feel that movement in the bar, like when the bar is ripping off the ground, or when it's hopping off your back at the top of a squat. But that would be my main thing. Of most athletes spend much too much time in a kind of off-season strength phase, and then they think that will transfer over into their sport, where your sport isn't a maximal strength sport. Like, you're going to be much better off with power output stuff.
What's the difference between a barbell Ordeal and a dumbbell Ordeal? So in general, the barbell dumbbell would just be low difference realistically. You would see people in general with better technique with dumbbell Ordeals. Usually what you'll see is dumbbell Ordeals will be better for single leg Ordeals, and the barbell stuff will just be a larger loading. It's quite hard to get a highly effective loading on your back with dumbbells. but then you probably feel it more in your hamstrings, which logistically would be then a stiff-legged deadlift with the dumbbells. So just loading difference and slightly different targeting.
I think the other thing with the dumbbells when you look at like beginners is if you give someone who's not great at single leg RDL or even a normal RDL, they can move that center of mass around the small with the dumbbells. So if they're kind of favoring one side, they can adjust for that and they can get the reps and sets done quite well. And then slowly over time, they can start bringing in a barbell and learn the movement well. On the opposite case of that, if somebody is really unstable, or is it unstable? Somebody is really unstable, if you give them dumbbells, that will really fuck them up. Whereas if they have a barbell in their hand, they can develop some torque. So it kind of depends on the experience level and how well the person is in terms of like how well they're going to be able to move through that range of motion.
Any advice for an 18-year-old weightlifter getting back into training after not doing any weightlifting for 5 days because of college starting? So realistically, just start back at the nearest kind of inflection point to your program. So if you're on one of our block programs, just restart that block again. 5 days is very, very little in terms of like weightlifting, for example. It's not a huge deal. Just restart your kind of training block or training kind of cycle or whatever you were doing. If it's not, 6 months before under 8 weeks. If it's in the last 3 or 4 weeks, you can just restart that then and you'll be totally fine. Mr. Wolf.
Florian Neurer says, how good an indicator is soreness to track fatigue? So if you're still sore at a muscle group you want to train, should you take a rest day and avoid training that muscle group in the next training? To be honest, soreness is so far down the line of effective tools for figuring out where you are. The problem is for most people, they have no tools in figuring out where they are in terms of fatigue and recovery. So the number one thing you need to look at first is like, what are you training? Are you training just for hypertrophy? Like if you're a bodybuilder and you're just looking at muscle breakdown or recovery of that muscle breakdown, muscle soreness or the absence of DOMs is probably going to be an all right tool. But if you're in a performance setting, so if you're trying to get stronger, if you're trying to get more powerful, if you're trying to get better at weightlifting, soreness really doesn't matter. Like that's not what you need to look at. The number one way I like to track fatigue in people is looking at what they've done for the last 6 weeks of training or 2 months of training and say, I know they can handle 5x5 at 75% because they did that 6 weeks ago. I know they can now handle 4 sets of 10 at 60% because they did that 2 weeks ago. I know they can handle this. And then it's that kind of learned fatigue to recovery ratio that you pick up over time. That's another reason for journaling and why we like people to journal so much is because you can keep track of that. And you could say, okay, I feel kind of shit today, but I know I felt shit last week as well and it didn't do me any harm. Or I know last time I PR'd my back squat, I felt quite sore beforehand and it was still good. So for the performance athlete, DOMs and soreness or the absence of either of those isn't really a sign that you're recovered. Also, you could have no muscle soreness and you could be fatigued as fuck and your nervous system will be absolutely fried and you'd be in terrible condition for lifting. So that is like long-term tracking is a much better tool than soreness or lack thereof. For bodybuilders or people who are just generally looking to get in better shape, soreness is probably an all right tool. It's the kind of sledgehammer instead of the scalpel again, but it is an all right tool.
Jimmy Jam says, will lifting weights in the morning kill your testosterone? I would say absolutely no. I can't imagine the reason why that would kill your testosterone.
To be honest, I think it would increase your testosterone versus not lifting weights at all.
Daniel Howard says, hello, in the most recent combat vid, you said 20 minutes is the minimum for cardio. Why is this?
So when you have cardiovascular work, and a lot of the time what you're looking for is you're looking for a specific aerobic adaptation, and you're looking most of the time not for it to be kind of very, very glycolytic. A lot of the time you want it to be slightly utilizing lipids, slightly utilizing some carbohydrates when you're training. 20 minutes and kind of beyond that is when we only start getting into those brackets. So no matter how hard I work now for the first 10 minutes of a session, it will be almost entirely glycolytic, right? So that's oxidative glycolytic in terms of the energy system you're using. But for most of our sporting applications, sport, you're talking about an hour minimum. You're talking about an hour minimum. If it's soccer, you're talking about 2 hours minimum when you take in breaks and warm-ups and everything like that. So for me to have a good aerobic system that's very, very good at processing both carbohydrates and turning it into glycogen and also lipids, it needs to be longer than 20 minutes. That's why HIIT doesn't really do it. It gets you a fair amount of calories burned, but it won't get you into those kind of higher aerobic realms of getting a lot of endurance work done.
My advantages of being built like a T-Rex, I assume dominance in the not Jurassic period, maybe whatever period they were in.
It was Jurassic, wasn't it?
No, I don't think there was any.
Jurassic Park.
I see that was incorrect. I believe.
No way.
Apparently so. My friend is a goalkeeper. Been watching a lot of your stuff on True Athletes. What's your opinion on him benching? Don't want him sliding up, bulk up too much. Maybe focus on benching for speed.
No, you should just have a big, like, he's just an athlete. So the use of bench press would be to build some sort of general strength and some sort of general longevity or resistance towards or resilience towards injury. So for him, like a 1.5 times bodyweight bench press is probably just what you need to get to in terms of making sure he's not going to break his shoulder when he falls on the ground. And for like, he's not going to be fending people off with his hands, but he will certainly be getting involved in like shouldering or pushing people out of the way if it's a corner coming in like that, if it's a soccer goalkeeper. But yeah, he should. Speed benching isn't it, you know. That's not really like this skill specific piece for a goalkeeper. Is they must be incredibly dynamic in their ability. Like, so agility is your ability to change direction quickly. So for a goalkeeper, he actually does need to be very, very agile. So even if he is standing on one spot and he needs to explode from one side to the other, it's still an expression of agility. As Gerf just showed you with the little mannequin, it's still an expression of agility. He needs to be able to load his legs very, very quickly and dive to the side. He'll very rarely be in the position where he needs to load his chest very quickly and thrust out in front or thrust out to the side. So he should be concentrating mainly on entire body kind of rigidity, like so becoming very resilient towards injury. Should be focusing on reaction time, and he should be focusing on lower limb power outputs a lot. Like he should have an incredibly strong box jump, a very good depth jump. He should also be looking at specific reaction time drills, peripheral vision drills, like we spoke about a few weeks ago. All those things are going to be very, very beneficial.
Olivier, or Oliver, or not even Oliver, Philip, really. What do you think must be included in perfect warm-up before Olympic training session? Any differences for competition? So just ensure you are adequately moving pain-free. You're thoroughly warmed up in terms of body temperature, and you have practiced the barbell movements for multiple sets until you're incredibly comfortable and there's no resilience going to the bottom position. After that, then it depends on the individual, but that would be my advice for you there. Dennister one says, I'd like to ask, you want to that?
No.
I'd like to ask about pushing through your squats on heavy volume days. So if you're on your 4th or 5th set and the 4th rep is quite a struggle, should you still push through the 5th rep? Yes, because you want to get better.
Absolutely.
If you want to get better, yes is the answer to that one. Okay.
The other thing is, like, there's heavy squat days are the days you actually make the most progress, you know, and granted you'll have to build up a lot of volume over time to make real progress, but in terms of psychologically building a bit of momentum, it's all about making that 4th set, making that 5th set, becoming very powerful in those 4th or 5th sets. So there's going to be times where you have to sit down, sit on a box, wait for 5 minutes instead of waiting for 2 minutes, and just say, fuck, I know this is going to be really, really hard, but I'm going to make it. Like, just, they're the little moral victories, and they're the little pieces that will build and build and build towards PRs. Squatting moderately hard all the time won't really make you too much better. Like, you do need those big jumps or those big hurdles to get over.
That's around for the live stream thing. So
oh, sweet.
Patrick Miller is probably the first. If you want to jump
Patrick Miller and says, hey, bud.
No.
Okay, can you comment on what to do for athletes dealing with depression? I suffer from SAD, so seasonal
affective disorder, isn't it?
Seasonal affective disorder, I think, yeah. And when I get low, training always ends up falling to the wayside. When I get back, I feel I lost all the work. So, Patrick, the first thing is, like, in terms of mental health issues, you really do need to see a mental, or like firstly, just your normal health person. So whether that's your GP, your physician, whoever that is in whatever country you're in, that is the number one thing you need to do. So even if you think you're presenting with some of these symptoms, so in terms of depression, one of those symptoms would be feelings of low mood, loss of enjoyment in previously enjoyable activities, a feeling like you need to pull away from people, and it's those feelings lasting for longer than 10 days or 2 weeks. Obviously, we all have times where we feel quite low, or where we feel not as good as we did before. In those cases, you really do have to go to your primary healthcare practitioner and say, okay, I think something is up. And this goes for everyone, no matter what country you're in. That's your first step. You don't go immediately to a mental health practitioner. You go firstly to your normal doctor, where you go for a cough, a cold, a flu, wherever. Usually that will then bring you on a referral pathway where you get referred to a mental health specialist. Over here, it will be to some sort of psychologist or something along those lines. And then they'd look at things like blood values, taking blood to see what you're like in terms of your hormones being in balance or not being in balance. It might be a host of things leading into this. So if it's sad, it might be sad plus 3 or 4 other factors that are leading to these feelings of low mood, right? In the case, so we can't speak specifically of your case, but in the case where you've gone and you've sought this help and you've been referred on and you've received help from them, and you're wondering how to kind of get back into training in that environment, that probably is something we can help with, right? So for athletes who are coming back, they've sought some treatment and the treatment is in progress. You really do need to look at a few things. The first thing is you need to look at where you are right now, right? So a lot of the time people will say, oh, I stopped 4 weeks ago and I was doing 5x5 at 100 kilos. So where do I go from now? That really doesn't matter. Like anything you've done before, no matter how recent it is, really doesn't matter, because if it's been 3 or 4 weeks since you've trained, you're basically back to a baseline. Now, everyone's baseline is different, but for a lot of people, it's going to be drastically lower, probably around 60% of where you were previously. The first 2 to 3 weeks is just getting you back to being able to train. And then after that initial 2 or 3 weeks, it's about getting back to training where you were in your current progression. So physically, the first thing you need to do is actually just get back into the gym, start moving around, start getting back into the general kind of flow, that routine, that lifestyle of training, eating, recovering, sleeping, and going through that cycle all over again. And that is the kind of, that's the first place you start. Once you've done that for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, then you can start saying, okay, this is where I am right now. I feel like I could back squat 80 kilos for 5x5. So I might need to start that program I was just doing, or I might need to regress that program I was just doing by 3, 4, 5 weeks and go again from there. So it's a very difficult place. The other thing you need to take into account is like training, pushing training hard or not pushing training hard will affect your mood. And you need to be very, very cognizant of that. So if you're in a position where you get really stressed around training, or if you're not progressing, you get kind of pissed off around training, then that is not the best place to go when you're working on things like that. Particularly at this time of year, if you're in Ireland, it's grey all the time. And SAD isn't going to kind of go away within the next week or two. That's going to be something that you'll be working on for the next number of months. And if training has negative connotations for you, then you need to find an alternative path. It's not necessarily just something you're going to put a Band-Aid over and keep going. I kind of highly recommend just finding some other more enjoyable form of physical activity and going from there.
You know, as well, I've never ever heard someone say that they regretted going to a mental health specialist. I've never heard someone say that it was something they regretted doing. So just bear that in mind, you know, in person or online, I've never heard someone say that was the worst, that made their decision worse or made their condition worse, you know. So if you do have it, it can only get better by going and seeing someone who knows what they're doing, obviously. Not going seeing any, what did you call them in college? What did the university that went to lectures call them?
We called them all sorts.
What was the proper name for them? They had a more cordial name.
Pseudo-science?
No, there was a name you had for them where they were quacks or
charlatans, like.
Wasn't really charlatan, you did.
But yeah, I wouldn't go to like a mental health specialist who has an Instagram page and no qualifications. One thing to be cognizant of as well is that your GP deals with this every single day, multiple times per day. Like if you think the amount of people walking into a GP's office and they say, oh, I have this pain in my chest or in my shoulder, or I can't sleep at night, and also I have this issue going on. This is something that's very, very, very common. They're very well equipped in dealing with.
Abdul Fitz.
You're here.
You're on a post-it.
You're right here. I'll cover your. You're on the list, so we'll get you. We try and just get people on calls to have a chat with them before we get them started. So Abdul, you will be or Abdullah, you will be contacted within the next few days.
Patrick's wondering when the t-shirts will be on sale. Once we have the full order of all the clothes, so we just had to get another version of the pants because we just some issues with them. So once everything is ready, after this big block, I think the next block we're just going to do some graphic t-shirts by themselves because we have a couple of things we want to do with those, a couple of different designs, I think, just to get people some cool t-shirts. So the next block will be sooner and more streamlined, and then assuming then like springtime we'll do another block of different clothes again.
Dennister1 says, regarding neck position in the back squat or front squat, I see some people recommending looking down. Ivan also said something about looking up to keep upright, which is better. So in terms of like how a physiotherapist will tell you how to squat, or how you would biomechanically ideally squat, you would have your neck fully stacked. So your spinal column would be one straight line coming down here, right? So you want every disc stacked on top of each other. For most people, that would look something directly like this. A lot of the time we'll see high bar back squatters will slightly elongate their neck, or they will extend their neck up like this. What they're trying to do is they're trying to manipulate their center of mass, right? So our head weighs around 7 kilos. This is one of the reasons as well why little children are able to squat with such exceptional form, is because they can manipulate a huge proportion of their mass just by moving their skull around, right? For a lot of people, when they start pulling their head back like this, they're doing a very upright squat. Their tendency will be to fall forward, and then by moving their head back, or as they start to stand up, when they throw their head back, it allows them to keep their weight more centered in the middle of their foot, and they get some feeling or a pseudo feeling of tightness in their upper back that people like. In an ideal situation, if you were to strap on some sensors onto people's legs, they will be they would be strongest with a fully stacked neck position, right? So it's all about trying to fire as many neurotransmitters down your spinal column as possible. In the case of wanting to be very upright, there's a certain advantage also to having a higher gaze. So you should be looking slightly upright all the time. I don't like powerlifters who tuck their head down like this. There's a huge disadvantage in looking down at the floor, and instead of relying on proprioception to feel your depth, you're relying on visual feedback. That is very, very maladaptive in terms of how well it will allow you to train your squat. So as straight head neck as you can have, looking straight forward or slightly up.
What do you think weightlifter aesthetic should look like? Ilian as a 94 in London is the ideal build for a weightlifter. Great power to weight ratio, ideal metrics for arm length ratio, fucking singlets, everything you can imagine. Ilya as a 94 in London was the ideal aesthetic for a weightlifter.
Or Gabriel.
Or Gabriel in Rio.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice haircut. You woke on this week, to be fair. You have your Fitz didn't know you had a widow's peak. It's called a cowslick in Ireland.
I didn't know what a widow's peak was. Okay, we've already gone through perfect warm-up.
Jack Hall says, how to increase ghrelin? My appetite is always in the toilet, especially after training, which leaves me only a few hours a day that I can eat a lot of food since I train 3 times per day.
There is no real, there's obviously some bad substances you can take that will help with this, but you really do have to grin and bear it, Jack. It's a thing most athletes will struggle with when their volumes are as high as yours are. Like, you really do need to firstly plan out every single meal, plan out every single macronutrient in terms of when you're taking it. So you're timing your carbohydrates at the right time, you're timing those heavier digestible things like proteins or fats at the right time. But it really is like one of the harder parts of being a full-time athlete is having to force food into you. In terms of two, recommend the first thing I'd recommend is being slightly more on top of your food selection. So there's certain diet protocols that are very, very effective for getting in large amounts of food in short times. The vertical diet PDF is a good example of kind of identifying good macronutrients dense foods that are very, very easily digestible and fast to digest, but that also work well in an athletic term. So it's very, very easy to get 4,500 calories of Ben and Jerry's, but it's going to make you terrible at competing in your sport, whether that's canoeing or whatever it is. But certain things like white rice with chicken stock put over them, all these things can really help us to take on a lot more food better. And also having a better macronutrient split will allow you to not be as hungry, or not be as full, or to feel not as full for longer.
That's yours.
Oh yeah. Recommendation for weightlifting certification, or would any be good as long as you've specific system and technical model? You need to look at what's applied in your country, kind of. So the main thing I would look at is like if you have a governing body, like over here it's Weightlifting Ireland. In the UK it's BWL. You need to look at what system your country uses, because if you want to, like, the main thing for coaching athletes is seeing a lot of athletes. So you need to see a lot of athletes firstly in your own country and then start seeing them kind of remotely or whatever. And I would look at, like, your country might use the US model or whatever it is. I'd look at what model they use and then what certifications I can get in their model. To be honest, all the courses I've ever come across are pretty crap. You will learn certain stuff, like being a kind of more of a beginner or a beginner coach. You will learn stuff, and it's valuable and it's important that you go and do the certifications. But the main thing you need to look at is like what's recognized in your country.
Is periodization, from what I know, integral for athletes to make progress after a certain number of years of training experience? It's a problem with the question, right? There's not a problem with your question. There's a problem with giving you an answer that you want to know. So if we look at someone, for example, like Michael Jordan, for example, at the end of his career, we talked to Zach about him yesterday. So when we look at weightlifters, periodization to a certain extent would absolutely be integral towards the end of their career. It absolutely is. When we look at someone like, for example, Michael Jordan, he doesn't need to get better. He doesn't need to get better at squatting and benching realistically. He just needs to be able to keep playing basketball and practice basketball more. So is it integral for him to maintain? Probably not. Would it be more optimal if he kept using periodization in his off season? Almost certainly. Maintaining stuff can be done a lot easier than progressing, and it can be done with a lot less dedicated training. It can be done with a lot less intelligent training, most notably. You can do a lot dumber things with more talented athletes at the later stage of their training, because hopefully they've achieved a certain level of proficiency in S&C. Now, I know we haven't touched on yet, though, is that their system of training is very, very important. So, for example, while we might look at a basketball player is different to a weightlifter if we look at a track and field athlete. So sometimes we think about S&C being periodized. Also, with sport-specific work like track and field stuff. So if we had our hurdlers or our sprinters, their training, or their marathon runners or 5K or whatever, all their actual sport-specific training would have been periodized in the best systems, or still would be today, or to a certain extent. So for them to keep progressing, or even for them just to get back into race shape. So they might not be progressing later in their career, but they might be returning to previous form for multiple different competitions. So let's say they get to this level here, the gray, that might be all they ever need to get to, or might be all they ever be able to get to. But you should think about periodization as getting an athlete into the best possible shape they can for a very specific event at a very specific time. And then the main issue with periodization, but really the main issue with the human body, is it's very, very hard to maintain this peak periodization or this peak condition for a very long period of time. We're talking outside of like 5 to 10 days. So the problem with that comes from the fact that you need a lot of volume to get to the specific place, but you can't do a lot of volume because you accrue a level of fatigue. And so to stay at that level of conditioning, you also need to, get to your peak form, you need to drop off that volume. To get there and maintain it, you need a certain level of volume. So periodization is very intricate in terms of that. So yes and no, but it really depends on the athlete. But for the vast majority, so that was kind of the one reason. There was a few different sports scientists who came, like there was a Bondarchuk and there was one or two others, Abajev, but I wouldn't really call him a sports scientist, who were saying it's better if we stay, if at all possible, in sports-specific condition all year round. So that would be kind of, if you're looking at like field athletes, so like rugby players in season, or for example, basketball players in season, you're not going to periodize their training in season for them. We're just going to try and not let them get out of shape as much as possible. So you're not going to periodize that, but then you would aggressively periodize them then in their off season again to get them back into shape, and then have that inevitable decay of performance on season. No one's found a good answer yet, other than really intelligent, adaptable, smart coaches who can mind their athletes as much as possible in season. But no one's found a legitimate scientific method. It's a problem integral with the human body and the human system, where it's unavoidable for peak performance, and the nature of how sporting events are set up, and the nature of drug testing. So there's a lot to that.
Yeah, I think it is important to note that there is a faction out there at the moment that are pushing away periodization, like that concurrent training methodologies like Gerf is talking about. There is a movement towards that. That group is quite small. I know John Kiley has a fair bit of stuff on it at the moment. He's a big enough name in that world. And if you're looking at concurrent periodization stuff, that would be where I go. They have a lot of valid points there, right?
But the problem with the concurrent stuff is it's very hard to progress things.
Yeah, that's so like they like the guy he's working with is an American guy who is working with Swiss athletes and Austrian athletes, as far as I remember, in their throwers. They talk about having concurrent training sessions most of the way through a season. They have 2 or 3 training sessions that they constantly kind of gradually increase their stuff on. But even those guys take off seasons, and they do slightly different things in an off season. So it is, when you read the concurrent stuff, you do have to take it with a pinch of salt. A lot of their stuff is like all the periodization stuff comes from the old Russian system, and that's where the basis for all periodization lies. And then they're talking about how that basis all lies in doped sport, which I don't really give a huge amount of credence to, saying that that's the only reason you periodize athletes. Anyone who coaches a lot of people for any period of time at all realizes that nobody can keep going at the same thing for too long ever, no matter how tuned in you are to your own body, no matter how in shape you are as you're training, no matter how reserved you are with your training. Sometimes you just need to pull back, slightly deviate from the plan, and go again, and then come back to being more specific.
Most of the people who have arguments against periodization are unfortunately just misinformed or unable to apply periodization and don't understand it correctly. The argument for periodization being only for doped athletes has been around since like the 70s or 80s. Unfortunately, everyone was doped at the time, and people were different in the West for using different training methods. I just don't think, and it becomes kind of more clear every year, and more athletes we see and more we read and the more involved with, periodization isn't a model, it's basically the model, because it's fundamentally, unless sport changes hugely or the human body changes hugely in the next few years or in the next 5 minutes, periodization is basically the way you need to approach training if you want to achieve optimal performance. Now, for example, if you look at someone like Ivan Jurek, even he accidentally, when he kind of mentioned himself, would periodize himself into his training maxes. Unless you have very specific, very radically different goals from peak performance, which realistically no one really does, but then you're just a general athlete who likes training or something. Periodization is the rule, not our rule, realistically, I would say.
Okay, David Wells says, any recommendations for elbow pain in the front rack position? Inside my elbow always has pain in this position. David, sorry now, but no injury questions, nothing like this. Hypothetically, we'll answer this one with one very, very simple thing, and that's your lats are too tight. You're either not stretching them, not rolling them and trying to release them enough, or else you're not doing either of those hard enough or long enough. But that's broad across the stream. We will not fix injury or pain causing things because we're not doctors.
Evan Lee says, hi, does powerlifting, sumo, deadlift have any carryover to weightlifting? No.
No.
Evan
No.
Lee's in yours, isn't he?
Yeah, Evan, why are you asking that? No, absolutely zero carryover.
My best bench press is 130, and that was about 4 years ago. I think Clarence will have another. Will Smith will have there's one on his Patreon, but I think it'll be released maybe in like 2 or 3 weeks or something.
Okay. Jonathan Bound says, what's the most common mobility issue you see in the overhead squat, T-spine or shoulders? Ankle mobility, by far for me. Everyone's ankles are too tight, and then they think their shoulders are tight, and that's why their overhead squat position is fucked up. You can make inroads into someone's shoulder mobility over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. They can have perfect shoulder mobility, barring the fact that they have a serious injury or they've had an operation which actually restricts their shoulders mechanically. For most people, it's ankles, and ankles just take a hell of a lot longer to fix.
Saint Jamaica White says, do you think you need weightlifting shoes for squats? Like, does it help make more gains for your better form? Thank you as well. I wouldn't say 100% of everyone who squats with a barbell needs weightlifting shoes, but 100% of everyone I've seen squat with a barbell could just do with weightlifting shoes. The battery phone. Your phone go down?
Yeah.
Go down there.
No, that's okay. It's more than half full.
Oh, yeah, mine's the next thing, pods and look who's live. Thanks, Johnny. How much time does it take to front squat 100 kilos for an Alvis lifter? Immediately.
2 minutes.
I don't remember not being able to front squat 100 kilos.
No.
I think I could front squat 120 and back squat at the same time at the start.
Yeah. My first ever CrossFit class, I front squat at 130. Like, you don't... how long does it take to get to 100 kilo snatch, squat, whatever?
Yeah.
There's absolutely no level for any of that. People are so genetically different, and they've had such different amounts of training or physical work in their upbringing that some people, first time they get to the gym, I guarantee you there's people who could do 160 for a front squat or 180 for a front squat. And I guarantee you there's people who won't be able to front squat 40 kilos because I've seen it. People not being able to put 40 kilos on a barbell and squat it.
Stephen G says, suggestions for upper back lifts. Actually, sorry, one thing, you know, there are all those stories of people that are like, and he just came into the gym and he could deadlift 500 pounds. Like, I fully don't believe those stories. I think they're absolute horseshit.
No.
Suggestions for upper back lift exercise for powerlifting, power building. I'm a garage lifter. I deadlift as an accessory for squats. I just have squat and bench. Barbell rows all day. Nothing will come close to just lots of barbell rows. You think you could barbell row 3 times a week for higher reps would be my phenomenal. Nothing better than barbell rows. They're amazing for upper back.
My second thing onto barbell rows would be single arm cheater rows. So a heavy dumbbell with a lot of body English, feeling like pulling down your shoulder, pulling your shoulder all the way back up, pausing for a second at the top so you get a small bit of that eccentric movement as well, and then controlling it on the way down. That would be absolutely second from heavy barbell rows, my application.
There's one there, Tarkin.
Tarkin says, you guys have talked about training core to resist rotation passively. What about sports where active rotation is required? I'm a kayaker, but I guess this applies for throwers. Absolutely. So what you find with the core stuff, the rotation stuff, and the anti-rotation stuff, it's very, very similar to our core training and how we might utilize core training for people who have aggressive extension in the core, right? So weightlifters, when they're extending at the top, they're extending their lower, mid, and upper back, and then they're having to flex that again as they pull in underneath the barbell. Most of the time, we still train our core in an isometric movement because that's what the core is predominantly concerned with. It's not really concerned with opening and closing of the spine. Most of the time, we're concerned with keeping the spine in a single position. When you look at the rotational stuff, it's much the same, right? To a lesser degree, but very, very similar. So when I'm a thrower and I'm rotating in like this, most of what my core is doing is it's transferring load from my quads and my hips and my lower extremities. It's transferring that load and force through my core and up into my upper body so I can then put it into a discus, a paddle, or whatever it's going to be. So we firstly have to become very, very good at isometric work. What would the isometric look? What would the isometric work look for? Like for a thrower, that might be payload presses. It might be like a chop hold or something like that. It might be side planks. It might be clams. It might be side plank leg raise holds. Right. All of these things going very good at maintaining our midline rigidity and stopping it from rotating against itself, basically. Then you can go on to, once you become very, very good at isometric work, you then move on to slight amounts of concentric work. So the concentric work might look like a lateral wall ball throw against the wall. What I usually like to do is restrict their movement as much as possible. So I'll start people sitting on their ass, holding a med ball and throwing that med ball against the wall. They'll again go kneeling on one knee, throwing the med ball against the wall, kneeling on two knees. So you get more and more movement each time. And then you gradually go to standing. And obviously, as you go from sitting to kneeling to standing, you get more degrees of freedom in your movement. You get more muscle units involved, and you can use much, much more force as you're going through those movements. So that's how we train it. Isometric, very strong first. Then we have more concentric movements, and then we bring more degrees of freedom into those concentric movements. So we produce more force and we use more weight as we're doing them. And then the last thing I would look at doing is combining some sort of concentric with some sort of eccentric movement. So if Owen was training with me now, I would be a training partner and I would be throwing a ball hard at him. He would accept the ball and then he'd have to decelerate the ball and maybe throw it back against the wall or throw it back into me. So if you were a kayaker or rower, whatever it is, and you want to be training that active rotation of the midline, training with somebody else is very, very important because you do need that kind of deceleration aspect and then accelerating it into a wall or into another person again.
Alfred Jalakal, would you lose strength when recomping? Current around 87 kilos and 90% body fat. Want to get down around 13% body fat without losing strength gains? You'll definitely lose strength. You might be able to keep like 90% of that strength or so, but realistically, you're just going to lose strength. It's just going to happen. I'd be worried about maintaining as much muscle mass as possible. Sorry, that's the answer.
Johnny Brown has a question. Very tempted to buy the weightlifting program to train in my garage. Do I need more than squat stands, barbells, and bumpers? Johnny, I am going to shout out at you now what you will need to train. Block one. Do you reckon he's beginner program or block one? No, block one. Please stand by, Johnny. We're just so you will need barbell, bumper plates, squat stands. You will need ideally a kettlebell or a dumbbell for pressing over your head, but you can just use a normal bumper plate, 2.5 kilo plate or a 5 kilo plate. We have some stuff in there for use with a band, so a long band, ideally a red one or a blue one, so lightweight or moderately weighted one. You can just substitute in your normal plate work or your normal row work in place of a band, and that's all you're going to need. Anything else, you can just substitute in with a barbell and plates. Most people who ran that program last year just had barbell plates, and a lot of them didn't even have squat stands, and they just substituted in a lighter squat where they were able to power clean it up and put it on their back. So very, very doable in a garage at home with minimal equipment.
You said the T-pose, the idle stand. Is daily caffeine consumption healthy? At what time does it become unhealthy? Daily coffee consumption seems to be heavily in the positive direction of being healthy. Caffeine is not something that is typically separated from the coffee, so there's a bit of nuance to that. At what point does caffeine become unhealthy? Usually beyond, for like most people, once it's beyond like 250 milligrams or 200 milligrams a day, it starts becoming kind of detrimental to your lifestyle in terms of negative effects, primarily on your sleep, probably on your anxiety. And
yeah, definitely.
So coffee consumption seems to be very favorably healthy. Caffeine consumption is...
yeah, excessive caffeine consumption is definitely negative.
Definitely negative.
Also, if like a lot of you are obviously concerned with performance on here, and if you're taking more than kind of 150 milligrams of caffeine per day, and then you're trying to use it as a performance enhancing substance as well when you go to lift weights or train, it's obviously going to be negative, right? Because you've dampened the effect, you've dampened your sensitivity to it. If you think you haven't, I would not drink coffee for 7 days in a row and then go and train with probably 300, 350 milligrams of caffeine, and you will feel like you are on methamphetamine. So I would be very, very cognizant that it is definitely affecting your performance. Okay.
Hey guys.
Pick some random.
I will always add volume to programs, even though I know it isn't ideal, because I feel guilty about not doing a lot of work. Any advice to get over this? Stop being a cunt, Paul. Do your program as a
My God.
Hello from Australia. Keep up the Oct contact sector interview with Ivan Jurek. Interesting collab and find yourself. Thanks, Jaden.
GRK Stud 97 says, in WADA's prohibitive list, they have banned gene editing, gene silencing, gene transfer techniques. What is the feasibility of this method of doping? Do you know any CRISPR athletes?
Broderick is convinced Jamaica, or he thinks Jamaica probably have some form of gene doped athletes.
Yeah.
And China definitely have gene doped athletes. They were talking about this pre-2008 in Beijing with some form of a red blood cell doping. So there was some kind of investigative journalist. So I guarantee you China have done it. But if China have done it and Jamaica are possibly doing it, there's probably a huge chance other people have done it or are doing it or will do it very, very soon. And it will be nearly impossible to avoid gene doping.
It's like the urban legend thing of like porn on the internet. If you can imagine it happening, it exists and it's on the internet. If you can imagine it happening with doping, somebody has tried it and it probably exists right now. The CRISPR stuff is definitely out there.
The feasibility of it right now is the problem with gene doping right now is that so the problem with ensuring consistency of a genetic expression is very difficult. It's hard to ensure that the gene that is you want to be not expressed or you want the gene to continue to be expressed, it's hard for them to make that a consistent permanent change. The problem with gene doping is, or not gene doping, gene medicine, let's say gene editing, it's very hard to know exactly what to edit. It's very hard to know what are the unintended consequences of gene doping. There's also the issue as well is that it's very, very difficult to go back if you make a permanent change to someone's genetics, as it's so intricate. The understanding of it is very, very difficult. So, for example, if we edit Fitz's genetics, for example, to for example, like I did the 23andMe recently, and there's like 2 copies of actin-3, and we edit Fitz's genes to make him have 2 copies of the actin-3, for example. But for some reason, it makes Fitz kidneys fail, right? There is almost no way we could stop that or revert that happening again. So that's a major issue with that. Also, the other issue to less extent is that if it's done post-fetal, post-fetus, and once you're born, it's not transferable, it's not hereditary. So if it's done in the fetus, then you are transferring it. So if you go wrong, obviously you don't want to be editing fetus's DNA because obviously you have no fucking idea what could happen realistically right now. The main issue right now is just too many unknowns is the main issue with that. But that has not stopped people doing crazy things before.
They actually pushed this kind of genetic, not genetic doping, but in a medicine sense. So muscular atrophy, or like the number of conditions where people are hit with severe muscular atrophy, it's debilitating, right? You get people and they basically, all their muscle tissue rots. They won't live beyond being kind of late teenagers. The ones who do are severely, severely disabled. And then it ends up being this really prolonged, drawn out illness, which is almost 100% fatal. And in these cases, they were looking at genetic changes and altering people's genes to, so it's myostatin they're kind of altering. So a myostatin inhibitor, or kind of turning on one of those genes basically to allow people to regenerate muscle tissue, stop this kind of atrophy from happening so they can maintain, be able to survive basically. They'll still be able to manipulate their diaphragm, they'll still be able to move around and walk. In this case, there was a few tragic happenings with people who were having these tests. So they had a number of very positive outcomes from this, where severe muscular atrophy was altered or slowed down, and then they had a number of very, very catastrophic failures of that system, which basically stopped testing in most of the first world countries where a lot of medical protocols and medications are kind of pioneered. So that's why a lot of this technology exists, but it's not currently being studied or not aggressively being pursued in human populations due to the fact that it's gone terribly badly a number of times.
Well, it's been aggressively studied in lots of places. Like, it's very, like, there's a huge amount of research on it, you know.
Yeah.
It's just not human trials are very hard to get to.
Someone wants to know, Enoch Crosby wants to know how long the Secret Press program is. It's 8 weeks. 8 weeks, 2 sessions per week. Jacob asks, could you elaborate on why you aren't fully on board with athletes doing power clean? Sorry if I misrepresented you. I'm not sure how to word this. So we have no problem with athletes doing power cleans if they're the right tool at the right time for the right person. We could make a blanket statement now of every athlete should be back squatting, and I guarantee you there's some athletes who shouldn't be back squatting right now. There are very, very specific and well-defined times when power cleans are a great tool to use. But then there are certain cases where someone's mobility, someone's motor pattern, someone's period of training currently, someone's ability to learn new things, the amount of time someone has to learn new things just aren't going to be up to scratch. And then a power clean is not good for them. So if I get a 37-year-old rugby player and they start coming into me for the first time and I'm programming for them for the first time, they've never done power cleans or their ability to do power cleans is very, very poor, there is absolutely no bother or no reason for me to get them 6 months down the line of learning how to do a power clean, and then they're 2.5 years from retirement anyway, or 1.5 years from retirement. There's no point. It's completely different if I have a 16-year-old and she's a very good track athlete, she's really good mobility, she can front rack a barbell quite well, she can learn new skills quite well, and she needs power production work. No reason for her not to do power cleans, but you can't just have a blanket statement of everyone should do power cleans all the time when you can get very similar results. They mightn't be exactly the same, but you can get very similar results with slightly different exercises.
And he got,
Luke Harvey.
There's one about the press program. Any special equipment is required for the press program, Sean? Nothing special. If you're in a gym, you'll be totally fine. If you're at home, you'll need some kind of resistance band. Ideally, some dumbbells, but you could work around it with the seated overhead dumbbell press in one part of the program. But you can actually do seated overhead barbell press on that issue, but you should be fine for everything else. Okay, I think, are we done?
We're done, I'd say.
Thanks for all the questions, guys. Thanks for everyone watching.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, thanks very much for tuning in. If you have any other questions, we'll be back on next week, and we'll talk to you all again soon.